Hi there. If you're watching this video, you've just logged into our budget website and are trying to get more context about where we are with the budget this year and this fall. I'm going to share a presentation with you that I gave to our shared governance groups, our cabinet, and other leaders across the campus. This is just here to provide a little bit more context about where we are with our budget planning, and I'll keep this website updated as we go through the year so that you can always come back here and find the most current information. So I'm going to get us started. So this slide shows us a little bit of a history of our operating fund balance. And why am I starting here with the fund balance? Well, there's been so much conversation as we go through a lean budget time. Are we going to be able to use the fund balance? And does the university have one? And the good news is we have about 20.5 million. It's this number right here for fund balance actuals as we ended the 1920 budget year. So with that, we're going to use part of that to help offset some of our budget issues this year that are in response to COVID. But we want to make sure that we are responsible with our dollars. And just like the governor of the state of California and the CSU, we really need to look at a multi-year planning horizon. So we don't want to spend it all this year, but we do want to spend a percentage of it. But before we can talk about that, let me tell you a little bit about this slide. Some of the areas in our operating fund balance are restricted, which means, for example, students pay a student health and counseling services fee. So those dollars that we receive from that fee are restricted to that fund as they should be. And so this is just a list on this slide of all of the different restricted dollars that is in our fund balance, which means that we can't spend that 3.9 million on anything else. And that's what's here, almost $4 million. Then this slide shows some dollars in our fund balance that are committed. So that means that we've made promises on how we're going to spend those dollars. One area to look at is when we hire faculty, sometimes they have research startup costs. That includes things like labs and tech and other equipment. And we've committed, as you can see right here, about $537,000 to those faculty. So we're going to keep that commitment. And that's what this slide is about, other committed costs from that fund balance that move forward. So if we take the restricted amounts, which is right here, which I showed you just 2 slides ago, and then we take the committed amounts, that means of that fund balance, that 20.5 million, we have 11.9 million that we can share moving forward. And so we're going to take that 11.9 million and then we're going to go back and think about that in a multi-year process. So if we take that almost $12 million and we say in this year, we might spend up to 40% of it to offset some of the issues that we have with incoming revenue or budget cuts. And then in the next 2 years, we might spend up to 30%. Now, some of the questions that have come up when I presented this is, will we take it to 0? And no, we won't take it to 0. We'll watch that closely, but this gives us some benchmarks, maybe up to 40% this year and up to 30% in the 2 subsequent years. One of the things we want to be ready for is if our economic projections for next year might be even worse than they are this year. So that's how we think about fund balance. And I'll come back to that later. So we're just going to leave that for now. And I'm going to go on and talk to you just a little bit about university funding in general and how it works. For those of you that already know this, just please bear with me. But this slide is basically a pie chart right here of our university funding for the past year, 1920. So we have tuition and fees in the red part of the pie and the state appropriation in the blue part of the pie. Those together make up what we think of as our operating fund. And last year that was at about a little over 206 million. So that's kind of how we, on the state side, what we operate under is about 206 million makes up that budget. But then if you look at the green part of the pie here, that makes up our other auxiliaries that need to kind of run themselves almost like a small business. There's housing in there and parking, our CSUSM corporation, which has our research grants, extended learning, other things like that. So that doesn't go in our day-to-day operating fund or help fund the state side, but it helps those areas that really run themselves like a small business, which means they bring in the revenue and spend those dollars, and no other dollars do they spend. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about some of the losses that are coming out of that 1920 budget. So this first slide talks about is one of the first slides we'll talk about with projected financial losses. And this slide shows the state-based budget reduction. So if you recall, the governor stated that he was doing a 7.5% cut to the CSU. And then the CSU distributed part of that cut to the campuses. And our part of that cut is $3.1 million. So that is a specific cut to our operating fund, less dollars that we have to spend on the state side this year than last year. Then if we look at this slide, it really comes from that other part of the pie that was tuition and fees. Now, you all did such good work this year. If you're tuning in from the campus community, our faculty, our staff, and our students, really helping students return, as well as assisting new students to come to CSUSM. So our fall enrollment, well, we projected that we might be as much as 3% down. It actually has come in pretty close to flat, which means we have the same number of students this year as last year. But we don't have the same number of what we call non-resident students, which would be our international students. We have, or our out-of-state students. We have 100 fewer of those right now, approximately. And so that accounts for about 831,000, which we know we don't have, and might even lose a little bit more when we see what happens in spring. But here, we're also, as we look to spring, really conservatively budgeting a loss in resident tuition and fees to be about 1.5% down. So we're still looking at a possible enrollment decline when we look at fall and spring together. This is, of course, an estimate, and this could change, obviously, and if we do a lot of hard work and through a shared governance process, we decided on spring admissions and we bring that up to a flat enrollment in the spring, then we won't lose that $1.8 million. So the goal is to have a flat enrollment, but we know from looking at the numbers and what we have, if everything doesn't work out, we might be more likely to have that 1.5% enrollment decline. So we're just trying to be cautious as we plan for our budget this year. Okay, one of the things that I should have told you earlier, but I'm going to tell you about now is sometimes it's a little confusing what's base funded, which means it's funded every year, recurring year in and year out. In fact, I'm going to go back 2 slides and just remind you here, this 3.1, that was a permanent cut to our budget, which means it's not one time and we get it back next year. It means it's a permanent cut. And we're assuming this would be a permanent loss as well. That would be a new normal in enrollment. So we have the ability, again, if we make that flat enrollment, to change this, but we are looking at those as permanent cuts. We also sometimes have one-time funding where we get funding for just one year at a time, and that doesn't go into base. So there's base funding, which is recurring each and every year. And then sometimes we have one-time funding or one-time losses. What we've learned, because here our budget has always grown for the last several years, whether that's through enrollment or state appropriation, is that we have some things in our budget that have been funded through one-time dollars, but have not been part of a base allocation. And in this moment where there's no new dollars coming in, we won't have the funding for that. The other thing I would say about this is there's some things that the state normally funds, just normal cost increases, and this year we won't get those cost increases, which will amount to another $1 million. So here on this slide, what I'm showing you is mandatory costs that either the state isn't funding this year as they normally do because of the budget downturn, or things that we funded on one-time funds that we need to get on base funding. I'd point out the custodial is pretty important because people have those jobs and they really shouldn't be temporary jobs. And we've been working with CSUEU to say where are jobs that we're showing as temporary that really should be permanent positions, and custodial is one of those areas. Same thing, for example, with disability accommodations. There's another area here, ethnic studies, and that's a projected new expense as we move forward with the ethnic studies requirement, which is something we're excited to do, but it's not funded yet, so we need to leave a placeholder there. But that totals about $5.2 million. Then if we look at one more area of loss, it goes into that auxiliary piece. That piece of the pie I showed you, that where areas need to run like a small business. And this shows where we're going to show losses in those auxiliaries. About $5 million in parking costs and $2 million in housing costs. Together that's $7 million. And in this area, we're looking at that as one time, because we hope after this year, students will be moving back into housing and people will be parking on campus more regularly. But we know now, we didn't when we put this presentation up, that for both fall and spring will be primarily virtual, which causes those losses. So all this slide is a piece of pie, or a whole pie, that shows in different proportions where we see those losses coming. And I sent a letter out early this year that said we were projecting about 19 million in losses. But because of our good work with enrollment, really all of your good work with helping students to return and be on their success journey with our campus, or to helping new students find their way, that total came down to 18 million, and I just can't thank everybody enough for their hard work there. So that gives us a new pie on this slide that shows our projected university funding for this year. Again, this is a projection. We don't, could numbers change? Some of them could, especially those enrollment dollars, but that others we know for sure are the state funds. Those are a permanent cut. But here's our projection. Again, the tuition and fees and the state appropriation make up our base operating budget for the campus. And then we had that green piece of pie makes up those areas that really have to run like their own small business. And housing and parking, which you're going to see losses, are included in there. So how are we going to deal with these losses? Well, this is a slide that shows a bit of the accounting of what we're planning to do to make sure that we come out with a balanced budget in the end. So first we'll take that one time. So the potential financial impacts, we talked about that $7 million right here. That would be a loss this year in housing and parking. And we will use auxiliary reserves, primarily from parking, as well as the CARES reimbursement. I am doing this presentation from my home office, so my dog just decided to help us out with the presentation, but I'm going to keep going because this is the real world, and my dog is a part of that. So as we continue on this slide, we've got community engagement and unallocated base funding. So we found here that we have a little over $1 million that will help offset this base funding cut that comes out of our stateside operating funds that will help offset that $10.9 million by a little over $1 million. That leaves us with a deficit of 9.975 to make up for. I'm going to go back through this again, just in case I didn't explain it very well. So on the state side, the state operating side, we're looking at a 10.994 loss. That's that state cut and the tuition and operating fees. We're going to offset that a bit with money saved from the community engagement reorganization and unallocated base funding from last year. That's going to offset that by $1 million. So our net deficit is going to be 9.975 million. With that, each division is going to take a 3.75% cut. Now, I sent in my letter and in my conversations, we were looking at a 5% cut across the board, but finding some of these other savings, as well as how well we did in enrollment, has reduced that to a 3.75% base cut, which means it's going to recur year in and year out. But each division does have some one-time money in travel savings, as well as in travel savings, as well as in frozen positions that they may use one time as they look at a long-term trajectory to figure out how to handle that cut. And then we still, as you can see, have a remaining deficit of 2.696 million, and that we've got to make up for. Why are we at 3.75%? Well, one of the reasons is we want to make sure that we don't have any layoffs this year if we can help it. I have to say as a disclaimer, I can't make any promises, but we want to make sure, if at all possible, we don't have layoffs this year. And so in looking at what areas could cut, this should be able to be something that each area can handle without layoffs. It doesn't mean we won't lose positions, but we shouldn't lose people. Now, what are we going to do about this 2.696 million? Well, if you recall, going back to my earlier conversation about reserves, that remaining deficit will offset with that 40% that we could say we could spend up to in reserves, that 4.789 million. We'll use that to offset this 2.696. That's a one-time fix. And we still have to figure out how to take care of that permanently. But it gives us an on-ramp this year for planning. We're going to have our strategic planning coming in, and we can go through the year and reevaluate our priorities to help take care of the rest of that permanently. But we can use our reserves this year to offset that. The other thing that would offset that is if our enrollment came in. And if we did better in enrollment than we're projecting, that could also offset that number. And that would be helpful as well. So to summarize, we have about $10 million that we have to take care of on the state side after some of the adjustments that we're able to make. Each division will take a 3.75% cut. It's a base cut, but they may use some one-time this year that gives them a ramp to plan for future years. And then this remaining deficit that we would have, we'll take care of either by doing better in our enrollment planning, in our enrollment that is planned for here, or using our reserves. We'll also use some of those dollars in reserves, if needed, to help any unanticipated expenses that help you move the university forward. So that, in summary, is the budget presentation for the moment. And I'll update you as we go and as things change. So as enrollment comes in for the spring, or if any other changes come in from the state or federal level, I'll try and keep you updated. Both my dog Bailey and I are appreciative that you tuned in for this presentation. And I hope that you are having a great day. And thanks for taking an interest in the budget. Thanks so much.